My son sent me to prison for 2 years, blaming me for his wife's miscarriage. It was a crime I never committed. Every month they came to visit me behind the glass partitions, acting like a loving family. Every month I refused to see them. Today is the day of my release. They think they are picking up a broken old man who has lost his mind. They are wrong. The day of my release will be the very day they lose everything. I am Harlan Ford, 72 years old, and for the last 730 days I was known only as inmate number 8. If you are listening to this and you have ever been betrayed by your own flesh and blood, hit that like button right now. Let me know in the comments which city you are watching from, because what I am about to tell you is not just a story. It is a warning. The sound of the heavy steel gate slamming shut behind me was the sweetest sound I had heard in decades. It was 8 in the morning, but the sky was a bruised purple. Rain was falling in sheets. Cold, sharp, real rain. Not the damp, moldy air of the cell block I had breathed for 2 years. I took a deep breath. It smelled of wet asphalt and diesel fumes. To me, it smelled like freedom. I looked down at my clothes. It was the same charcoal gray suit I had worn the day of the trial, the day the judge pounded his gavel and took away my life. Back then, the suit fit me like armor. Now it hung off my shoulders like a shroud. I had lost 30 pounds in there. The prison food was garbage, but it was the rage that really consumed me. Rage burns more calories than a treadmill. I stood on the sidewalk holding nothing. No bag, no personal effects, just the clothes on my back and the fire in my gut. I saw them before they saw me. A sleek silver Bentley pulled up to the curb, splashing a puddle of dirty water onto my shoes. Subtle. Just like my son. The back door opened and Preston stepped out. My son. My only child. The boy I had taught to ride a bike. The man who had looked a judge in the eye and testified that I was a violent monster. He was wearing a Navy custom-made suit that probably cost more than the guard's annual salary. He adjusted his tie and flashed a smile. Not at me, but at the cameras. I had not noticed them at first. The paparazzi. 3 or 4 of them lurking near the parking lot entrance. Hired guns, no doubt tipped off by Tiffany. They wanted the photo op, the prodigal son forgiving the abusive father, a redemption arc for the company newsletter to keep the stock prices stable. Preston walked toward me. He opened his arms wide. To the world, through the lens of those cameras, it looked like a warm embrace. A son welcoming his father home. He pulled me in. I stood rigid like a statue carved from ice. I felt his hand clap my back. Hard. Too hard. He leaned in close, his cheek touching mine. His breath smelled of mint and expensive coffee. "Smile, Dad," he whispered. His voice was a hiss that the cameras could not pick up. "Do not look so miserable. The shareholders are watching. If the stock drops 1 point because you look like a convict, I will cut your commissary fund to 0. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I just stared straight ahead at the wet pavement. Then came Tiffany, my daughter-in-law, the mistress who became the wife, the woman who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. She stepped out of the car looking like she was walking a runway. Perfect blonde hair, perfect makeup, and in her arms a bundle wrapped in blue cashmere. She walked up to us, her heels clicking on the wet concrete. Her eyes were dry, but her face was contorted into a mask of practiced concern. "Look who is here, Harlan," she cooed. Her voice was like syrup laced with arsenic. "This is little Leo, your grandson. He has been waiting to meet you." She shoved the bundle into my face. I looked down. The baby was sleeping, innocent, unaware that he was being used as a prop in a sick play. I looked at the baby and then I looked at Tiffany. I saw the fear behind her layers of foundation. She held the baby out, expecting me to take him, expecting the photo of the repentant grandfather holding the new heir. I did not raise my hands. I kept them buried deep in my pockets. I looked right through her as if she were made of glass, as if she did not exist. I stepped to the side, bypassing her completely. The smile on her face faltered. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing the rejection. Preston stepped in front of me, blocking my path. His face turned red. "What are you doing?" he hissed through gritted teeth. "Get in the car. We have a dinner planned." I did not say a word. I simply walked around him. My eyes were fixed on a beat-up black Ford sedan parked 50 yards away. Leaning against it was a man holding a black umbrella. Garrett, my lawyer, my only friend. He was not wearing a flashy suit. He looked tired, but he was there. Loyalty is rare these days. Rarer than gold. I heard Preston's footsteps splashing behind me. He grabbed my arm. His grip was weak, soft hands. Hands that had never done a day of real work in their life. "Dad." "Stop making a scene," Preston growled. "You are embarrassing us. Get in the Bentley." I stopped. I turned my head slowly and looked at his hand on my sleeve. I did not speak. I just looked. The intensity of my glare made him recoil. He let go of my arm as if it were burning hot. I turned back and continued walking toward the Ford. Garrett opened the back door for me. I slid onto the cracked leather seat. It smelled of old tobacco and paper. It smelled like safety. As Garrett closed the door, I heard Preston screaming. He had lost his composure. The mask had slipped. "You are crazy, old man," he yelled, his voice cracking. "You have nowhere to go. The house is mine. The company is mine. You have nothing. Do you hear me? You are homeless." I watched through the rain-streaked window as he stood there in his expensive suit, getting soaked to the bone. Tiffany was pulling at his arm, trying to hide her face from the cameras. I sat back and closed my eyes. "I am not homeless," I whispered to myself as the engine roared to life. "I am just on a business trip, and I am coming to take it all back." The interior of the black Ford sedan smelled exactly as I remembered. It was a mix of old leather peppermint and the faint, dusty scent of legal briefs that had been sitting in the back seat for too long. Garrett Hale did not say a word as he pulled away from the curb. He navigated the car through the heavy rain, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I watched the side mirror. The silver Bentley and the crowd of reporters shrank into the distance until they were nothing but a gray blur against the prison walls. For the first time in 2 years, the air I breathed did not smell of industrial disinfectant and despair. Garrett cleared his throat. He looked older. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and his hair, which had been salt and pepper when I went in, was now almost entirely white. I knew that look. It was the look of a man who had been holding back an avalanche with a plastic spoon. "You look terrible," Harlan Garrett said, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. "I feel fantastic," I lied. My body was aching, and the suit felt like it was hanging off a skeleton, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. Prison does that to you. It strips away the distractions. No golf games, no board meetings, no charity galas. Just time. Time to think. Time to hate. Time to plan. "Tell me the damage," I said, cutting straight to the point. Garrett sighed. He reached into his briefcase on the passenger seat and pulled out a thick manila folder. He handed it back to me without turning around. "It is bad," he said softly. "Worse than we thought." I opened the folder. The pages were covered in red ink. I scanned the lines, my finger tracing the list of assets that were no longer mine. The lake house in Michigan was gone. Sold 6 months ago for half its market value. My collection of vintage watches pieces I had spent 40 years acquiring auctioned off to pay for what Preston called operational expenses. The trust fund I had set up for the employees' pension plan was drained. "He is bleeding the beast dry," Garrett said. "He sold the logistics fleet in the Southern District. He outsourced the trucking to a third-party vendor. A vendor, I might add, that is owned by one of Tiffany's cousins. I felt a cold rage settle in my chest, but I did not let it show. I turned the page. "What about the headquarters?" I asked. "The building downtown." "That is the only thing left," Garrett replied. "The crown jewel. He tried to sell it last month to a developer from Dubai, but the zoning laws you put in place 20 years ago made it difficult. He could not find a buyer who wanted to deal with the historic preservation restrictions." "Good," I whispered. "At least he is incompetent." Garrett hesitated. The car slowed down as we approached a red light. The rain drummed rhythmically against the roof. "There is something else," Harlan Garrett said, and his voice trembled slightly. "Something I found out 3 days ago. Preston was desperate. The crypto market crashed last week. He lost millions of the company's operating cash. He needed liquidity fast to cover the payroll and keep the creditors at bay." I closed the folder. I knew where this was going. "Who did he borrow from?" I asked. "He went to a private equity firm," Garrett said. "A shadow lender called Nemesis Corporation. They are sharks, Harlan. The worst kind. They specialize in distressed assets. They gave him a bridge loan of $12 million. The interest rate is predatory. It is practically criminal." I looked out the window. The city was passing by gray and wet, and the collateral I asked, though, I already knew the answer. Garrett gripped the wheel tighter. "Control," he said. "He pledged his executive voting rights. If he misses a single payment, or if the company's credit rating drops below a C grade, Nemesis Corporation has the right to seize his shares and take immediate control of the board." He signed his death warrant. "Harlan. These people do not play games. If they take over, the company is gone. They will strip it for parts." I sat back in the seat and let a small dry smile touch my lips. Garrett saw it in the mirror and frowned. "Why are you smiling?" he asked, sounding almost offended. "Did you hear me? Your son just handed the keys to your kingdom to a bunch of corporate raiders. We need to file an injunction. We need to find a way to pay off that loan before the first payment is due next week." I chuckled. It was a rough, rusty sound. "We will do no such thing," I said. Garrett slammed on the brakes as the light turned red. He turned around in his seat to face me, shock written all over his face. "Are you insane?" he demanded. "If Nemesis takes over, you lose everything too. Your legacy. The company you built from the ground up with a single truck. It will be gone." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the front seat. "Garrett," I said quietly, "who do you think owns Nemesis Corporation?" Garrett stared at me. He blinked, confused. "I do not know," he stammered. "It is a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The paperwork is buried under layers of anonymity. It is impossible to trace." "Not impossible," I said. "Just difficult." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small crumpled piece of paper. It was a receipt from the prison commissary, but on the back I had written a series of numbers, account numbers. "2 years is a long time, Garrett," I said. "You brought me books, you brought me legal pads, but you also brought me access. Do you remember the forensic accountant you hired for me? The one you thought was just reviewing my appeal case?" Garrett's eyes widened. "I had him set up Nemesis Corporation 6 months ago," I continued. "I liquidated my offshore accounts, the ones Preston did not know about, the emergency fund Beatrice and I saved for a rainy day. It seems it is raining today." "You," Garrett whispered. "You are Nemesis." I nodded. "I am the shark, Garrett. I lent my son the rope he is going to use to hang himself. He thinks he borrowed money from a faceless corporation. He has no idea he borrowed it from the father he betrayed." Garrett slumped back into his seat. He let out a long, shaky breath. He looked terrified, and for a moment I felt a twinge of guilt, but only a twinge. So Garrett said, his voice barely audible, We own the debt. We control the loan. We can call it in right now. We can walk into that boardroom tomorrow and tell him he is finished. I shook my head. No, I said, not yet. Why not? Garrett asked. Why wait? Because pain is a teacher, I said, looking back out at the rain. And Preston has not learned his lesson yet. If I strike now, he will play the victim. He will say he was just having a bad quarter. He will say the market was against him. He needs to believe he is safe. He needs to think the money from Nemesis saved him. I paused, watching a drop of water trace a path down the glass. Let him spend the money, I said. Let him buy Tiffany another diamond necklace. Let him think he has won. Let him climb higher, Garrett. Because the fall only kills you if you fall from a great height. When he feels untouchable, when his arrogance is at its peak, that is when we trigger the default clause. That is when I take it all back. Garrett turned back to the steering wheel. The light turned green. He put the car in gear, but his hands were shaking slightly. You are a scary man, Harlan, he said. I was a good man once, I replied. But good men do not survive in prison, and they certainly do not survive in this family. I sat back, closing my eyes, visualizing the look on Preston's face when the hammer finally fell. It would be beautiful. It would be tragic. But it had to be done. A surgeon does not apologize for cutting open a patient to remove a tumor. And Preston, my own son, had become a tumor that was killing my legacy. Where to? Garrett asked, his voice returning to its professional tone. I opened my eyes. The fire in my gut was burning hotter than ever. Take me home, I said. Take me to the mansion. I want to see what they have done to my house, and I want them to see that the ghost has returned to haunt them. Garrett nodded and merged onto the highway. The wipers slapped back and forth, a metronome counting down the moments until the war began. I was not just an ex-con anymore. I was Nemesis, and Judgment Day was coming. The iron gates of Ford Manor rose up before us like the teeth of a giant beast. I had installed these gates 30 years ago to keep the world out, to protect my family. But as Garrett stopped the car in front of the call box, I realized the beast was now guarding the monsters inside from me. The rain was still falling harder now, drumming a relentless rhythm against the roof of the sedan. I looked up at the stone pillars. My initials, HF, were still etched into the granite, but I knew that inside that compound, my name had been scrubbed from existence. Garrett rolled down the window. The cold air rushed in. He pressed the intercom button. Silence. He pressed it again. Static crackled, followed by a voice I did not recognize. A hired goon. Private security. State your business, the voice barked. This is Garrett Hale, legal counsel for Harlan Ford. Open the gate. There was a pause, heavy and deliberate. Then the voice returned, dripping with mockery. Mr. Ford does not live here anymore. We have strict orders, no trespassers. Turn around, or we will call the authorities. I felt a muscle in my jaw jump. I opened my door and stepped out into the rain. Garrett called after me, but I ignored him. I walked up to the pedestrian entrance, a smaller gate set into the wall. I placed my thumb on the biometric scanner. I had programmed this system myself. It was designed to recognize my print in less than a second. I pressed my thumb against the glass and waited for the familiar green light. Instead, a harsh red light flashed. Access denied. I pressed it again, harder. Access denied. They had deleted me. My own home, the place where I had raised my son, the place where I had nursed my wife through her final days, was rejecting me like a foreign virus. I stared at the red light, the rain dripping from my nose, and for a moment, the rage was so blinding, I wanted to tear the scanner off the wall with my bare hands. Then the sirens started. They were close. Too close. Tiffany must have called them the moment she saw our car turn onto the private road. She had been waiting for this. Watching from the window like a spider in a web. Blue and red lights flashed against the wet pavement as two patrol cars screeched to a halt behind Garrett's Ford. Doors flew open. 4 officers stepped out, hands hovering over their holsters. I turned slowly to face them. I knew the drill. I had learned it the hard way 2 years ago. Move slow. Keep your hands visible. Do not speak unless spoken to. Step away from the gate, the lead officer shouted. He was young, terrified, and dangerous. Put your hands in the air. Now. I raised my hands slowly. The rain soaked into my shirt, chilling me to the bone. I am not armed, I said, my voice calm, contrasting the storm inside me. This is my house. We have a 911 call reporting an attempted break-in and violation of a restraining order, the officer yelled, advancing on me. Turn around, hands on the wall. I did as I was told. I felt the cold, rough stone against my palms. The officer patted me down, his hands rough and intrusive. I looked up toward the house. The front door opened and Tiffany stepped out onto the porch, sheltered by the massive overhang. She was not crying now. She was pointing. That is him, she shrieked, her voice carrying over the wind. He is crazy. He threatened to kill us if we did not let him in. He is violent. Arrest him. And then above her on the second-floor balcony, the French doors opened. Preston stepped out. He held a crystal tumbler in one hand, swirling the amber liquid casually. He looked down at me, pinned against the wall of my own home by the police, and he smiled. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated triumph. Take the trash away, officers, Preston called down, his voice slurring slightly. He is trespassing on private property, and he is a convicted felon. We do not feel safe. The officer grabbed my wrist, pulling it behind my back. I felt the cold metal of the handcuffs brush against my skin. The sound of that metal clicking was a sound from my nightmares. I closed my eyes. Was this it? Was I going back to a cell before I had even spent a night as a free man? Wait. The voice was sharp, authoritative. Garrett stepped out of the car. He was holding a binder high in the air, oblivious to the rain ruining his suit. Officer, if you snap those cuffs on him, you will be facing a lawsuit for wrongful arrest and civil rights violation before the sun goes down. The officer paused, the cuff dangling from one of my wrists. He looked at Garrett, then up at Preston, then back at me. Who are you? The officer asked. I am his attorney, Garrett said, walking forward, with a confidence that made the police step back. And you are acting on false information. My client is not trespassing. He is home. Preston laughed from the balcony. It was a hollow, nervous sound. Do not listen to him, Preston shouted. I own the deed. The title is in my name. I have the papers to prove it. That old man has no rights here. Garrett did not look up. He walked straight to the lead officer and opened the binder to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. He tapped the paragraph with his finger. Read this, Garrett said. The officer squinted through the rain. He read the text, his lips moving silently. Then he stopped. He looked closer. He looked up at the house, then back at the document. What does this mean? The officer asked. It is a life estate clause. Garrett explained, his voice loud enough for Preston to hear. When Harlan's late wife, Beatrice Ford, transferred the property title to the trust that Preston now controls, she included a non-negotiable stipulation. Clause 4A. Regardless of ownership, title, or transfer, Harlan Ford retains the exclusive, irrevocable right to reside in the primary master suite of the property for the duration of his natural life. This right cannot be severed by sale, transfer, or familial dispute. I lowered my hands. The officer did not stop me. It means, Garrett continued, snapping the binder shut, that while Preston may own the bricks and mortar, Harlan owns the right to stand anywhere he damn well pleases inside those gates. If you arrest him for trespassing, you are arresting a man for standing in his own living room. The silence that followed was heavy. The only sound was the rain and the distant thunder. I turned to look up at the balcony. Preston's smile had vanished. He gripped the railing so hard I thought the wood might snap. Tiffany had stopped screaming. She stood on the porch, frozen, her mouth slightly open. "Officer," I said, brushing the water off my lapel. "I would like to go inside and dry off. My son seems to have forgotten the code to the gate. Would you mind asking him to open it? Or should I press charges for illegal eviction?" The officer looked at me, then at the document again. He unclipped the handcuff from my wrist. He looked annoyed not at me, but at the situation. He turned his face toward the balcony. "Mr. Ford," the officer shouted at Preston. "Open the gate." What? Preston yelled back. "No. He is dangerous." "The document is valid, sir," the officer replied, his hand resting on his baton. "Open the gate or we will have to cut the lock. And I will have to cite you for obstructing a resident's legal access. Do not make me come up there." Preston slammed his drink down on the railing. Glass shattered, raining shards down onto the patio below. He turned and stormed back inside, leaving the doors open. A moment later, the red light on the scanner turned green. The heavy iron gates groaned and began to swing open. I nodded to the officer. "Thank you for your service," I said. I walked past the security guard booth. The hired goon kept his head down, pretending to be busy with his phone. I walked up the long, winding driveway. The landscaping was different. My roses were gone, replaced by trendy, sharp-edged hedges that looked cold and uninviting. The fountain in the center of the circular drive was dry, filled with dead leaves. Neglect. It was everywhere. Preston wanted the status of the mansion, but he had no interest in the work required to maintain it. Garrett drove the car up behind me, but I kept walking. I wanted to enter on foot. I wanted them to hear my footsteps. I reached the front porch. Tiffany was still standing there. She had crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive posture. Her eyes were darting around, looking for a new angle, a new weapon she could use. But she had played her ace and I had trumped it. I walked up the steps. 1, 2, 3. I stopped right in front of her. She smelled of expensive perfume and fear. She tried to hold my gaze, tried to muster that arrogant sneer she had worn in the courtroom, but she faltered. She looked down. "You cannot stay here," she hissed, her voice trembling. "We will make your life a living hell. You will wish you were back in prison." I looked past her through the open front door. The foyer was changed. My antique Persian rug was gone, replaced by a modern white animal skin that looked ridiculous. But what caught my eye were the curtains in the grand salon. They used to be a soft, welcoming gold. Now they were heavy velvet dyed a deep, aggressive crimson. I looked back at Tiffany. I stepped close enough to whisper, invading her personal space, just enough to make her flinch. "I have been in hell for 2 years, Tiffany," I said softly. "I found it quite comfortable." I brushed past her, my shoulder checking hers, forcing her to stumble back in her high heels. I stepped across the threshold. The air inside was warm, but it felt stagnant. I turned back to look at her one last time before I closed the door on the world outside. "I see you redecorated," I said, gesturing to the salon. "You changed the curtains to red." Tiffany glared at me, her hands balled into fists. "So what?" she spat. I smiled, and for the first time that day, it was a genuine smile. "Good choice," I said. "The color of blood suits you." I turned and walked toward the stairs, leaving her standing in the cold, wet wind. I was inside. The enemy was within the walls, and the hunt had officially begun. The silence inside the manor was not the peaceful silence I remembered. It was a suffocating quiet. The kind that hangs in the air before a tornado touches down. I walked through the hallway, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor. My shoes were still damp from the rain, leaving faint, muddy prints on the white animal skin rug. I did not care. I walked past the living room and headed straight for the east wing. That was where my sanctuary used to be, my study. The room where I had built Ford Logistics from a single truck into an empire. The room where I had smoked cigars with senators and signed contracts that changed the skyline of this city. I reached the double oak doors. They were closed. I reached out to turn the brass handle, expecting the familiar resistance of the heavy wood. But the door swung open effortlessly. Too light, too hollow. I stepped inside and stopped dead in my tracks. My breath hitched in my throat. Gone. Everything was gone. My mahogany desk, the one hand-carved in Italy, was missing. The walls, once lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with first editions and legal encyclopedias, were stripped bare. They had been painted a jarring, clinical white. The smell of old paper and rich tobacco was replaced by the stinging scent of rubber and lemon disinfectant. Mirrors. They had covered the walls in mirrors. I stared at my reflection. A gaunt, gray-haired man in an ill-fitting suit standing in the middle of a nightmare. Where my leather armchair used to sit there was now a high-tech treadmill. Where I used to review quarterly reports, there was a rack of dumbbells and a yoga mat. They had turned my war room into a gym. Tiffany's gym. I saw a pink towel thrown carelessly over a bench press. I walked over and picked it up. It smelled of her perfume. Sickeningly sweet. I dropped it on the floor and wiped my hand on my pants. I felt a burning sensation in my chest, a pressure building behind my eyes. It was not just disrespect. It was erasure. They were trying to scrub me out of the history of this house. I turned away from the mirrors. I could not bear to look at what I had become in this room that used to define my power. I needed to find my things, my books, my papers, but most importantly, Beatrice. Beatrice's portrait. It had hung above the fireplace for 20 years, an oil painting commissioned for our 30th anniversary. She was wearing her favorite blue dress, smiling that soft, knowing smile that used to calm my worst storms. I looked at the fireplace. The space above the mantel was empty, just a white void. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my anger. I ran out of the room. I moved faster than I had in years, ignoring the ache in my knees. I headed for the back of the house, past the kitchen, to the servants' quarters and the storage rooms. If they had thrown my life away, this is where the debris would have landed. I tore open the door to the maintenance closet. It was dark and smelled of mildew and damp earth. I fumbled for the light switch. A single naked bulb flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the clutter. And there it was. Piled in a corner like garbage were boxes of my files, my awards. The key to the city I received 10 years ago was lying face down in a puddle of water leaking from a rusty pipe. But I did not care about the key. I dug through the pile, tossing aside plaques and trophies. Then I saw the corner of a gold frame. I pulled it out. My hands were trembling. It was Beatrice, but the canvas was torn. A long scratch ran across her cheek, likely from being dragged across the floor. The bottom of the frame was waterlogged, the wood swollen and rotting. Mold was starting to bloom on the corner of her blue dress. I sank to my knees on the cold, concrete floor. I pulled a handkerchief from my pocket and frantically tried to wipe away the dirt and the mold. "I am sorry," I whispered, my voice cracking in the empty room. "I am so sorry, B. I should have been here. I should have protected you." I held the frame against my chest, rocking back and forth. The rage that had been a fire was now turning into ice, solid, unbreakable. They could take my money. They could take my company. But to treat the memory of the woman who built this home with them like trash, that was not a mistake. That was a declaration of war. I stayed there for a long time, cleaning every inch of the frame until it was as clean as I could make it. I stood up, composing myself. I adjusted my tie. I picked up the portrait and walked back towards the main house. I would not leave her in the dark. She was coming back to the light. I carried the painting into the main living room. I placed it carefully on a side table, leaning it against the wall. I was just brushing a speck of dust from the glass when I heard footsteps behind me. heavy, arrogant. Well, look who is making himself at home. I turned slowly. Preston was standing in the doorway. He had changed out of his suit into casual clothes, designer jeans and a polo shirt that was too tight around the middle. He held a glass of whiskey in one hand. I did not answer him. I just stood in front of the portrait, shielding it. Preston walked into the room, his eyes scanning the space until they landed on the painting. He scoffed. "I thought we threw that old thing out," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "It really clashes with the new decor. Tiffany hates it. It is depressing." "It is your mother," I said, my voice low and steady. "It is a dusty old picture," Preston countered, waving his hand dismissively. "But fine. Keep it in your room. Just keep it out of sight. We have guests coming tonight. Important people. Investors. I do not want them seeing my father acting like a senile janitor carrying trash around the house." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a money clip. He peeled off a few bills and tossed them onto the coffee table between us. They fluttered down like dead leaves. "Here," Preston said. $500. That is your allowance for the month. Do not spend it all on candy." I looked at the money, then I looked at him. "Allowance," I repeated. "Yeah," Preston sneered. "You have no income, no pension. I froze your personal accounts, remember? Consider this charity. Go buy yourself a new shirt. That suit smells like prison. And tonight, do me a favor. Stay in your room. Do not come down. Do not embarrass me." He waited for me to explode. He wanted me to yell, to throw the money back in his face. He wanted to prove that I was the unstable, violent man he had painted me to be in court. I took a deep breath. I forced the muscles in my face to relax. I walked over to the coffee table. I picked up the bills. 500, I said, counting them slowly. I looked up at him and forced a small, tight smile. "Thank you, son," I said. "This is very generous of you." Preston blinked. He looked disappointed. He had lost his fight. "Yeah, well," he mumbled, turning away. "Just stay out of the way." He walked out of the room, taking his drink with him. I listened to his footsteps fade as he went upstairs to get ready for his party. I looked at the money in my hand. $500. The price of his arrogance. I pocketed the cash. "Thank you, son," I whispered again to the empty room. "This will buy me a front row seat to your funeral." I turned my attention to the large oak desk in the corner of the living room. It was the only piece of my original furniture they had kept, probably because it was too heavy to move. It was where Preston now sat to sign the checks he had no right to sign. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a small black device. It was no bigger than a button. I had acquired it from a contact on the inside, a man who used to work for intelligence before he ended up in cell block D. I knelt down. I felt under the heavy lip of the desk. I peeled off the adhesive backing and pressed the bug firmly against the wood, deep in the shadows where no one would ever look. I tapped it once to make sure it was secure. "Enjoy your party, Preston," I said softly. "Speak loudly. I want to hear every lie." I stood up, picked up Beatrice's portrait, and walked toward the stairs. The money was in my pocket. The bug was in place. The game was afoot. I was not just a guest in my own house anymore. I was the spy in the enemy's camp. And tonight, I would listen. I spent the next hour in the guest room bathroom scrubbing the prison grime off my skin until it was raw and red. I shaved off the gray stubble, revealing the sharp jawline that had intimidated union leaders and corporate raiders for 40 years. In the back of the cedar closet, wrapped in a garment bag that Tiffany had evidently missed during her purge, I found it. My tuxedo. It was a Brioni tailored in Rome 10 years ago. It was a little loose around the waist now, but with the right posture, it did not look like hand-me-downs. It looked like armor. I stood in front of the mirror. The man looking back at me was not inmate 8940. He was not the broken father who had been dragged away in handcuffs. He was Harlan Ford, founder, CEO, predator. I adjusted my cufflinks' gold knots that I had hidden in the toe of an old shoe. I checked the listening device in my pocket to make sure it was secure. Then I opened the door. Downstairs, the house was vibrating with the sound of a string quartet and the murmur of 50 voices trying to sound important. I could smell the catering, truffle oil and seared scallops, the scent of money. I walked to the top of the grand staircase. Below me, the foyer was filled with the city's elite, or at least the people who desperately wanted to be elite. I recognized a few faces: hedge fund managers with shaky reputations, real estate developers known for cutting corners. And right in the center, holding court, was Preston. He was laughing too loud. His face was flushed with expensive scotch. Tiffany hung on his arm wearing a red dress that matched the new curtains. A diamond necklace glittered at her throat. My mother's necklace. I felt a spike of adrenaline, but I forced my heart rate down. Stay cold, Harlan. Stay cold. I began to descend the stairs. I did not rush. I took one step at a time, my hand sliding down the mahogany banister. The conversation in the foyer did not stop all at once. It died out in waves as people noticed me. First the people near the stairs, then the people near the door, and finally Preston himself. The string quartet trailed off into an awkward silence. Preston stared up at me, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a child caught stealing from the cookie jar. He had told these people I was a senile invalid, a source of shame hidden away in the attic. He had not prepared them for the return of the king. I reached the bottom step. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path for me. I walked straight to a passing waiter, took a glass of champagne, and raised it slightly toward my son. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting effortlessly to the back of the room. "I hope you are enjoying my home." A few people murmured uncomfortable greetings. Preston recovered first. He handed his drink to Tiffany and marched over to me, a forced smile plastered on his face that did not reach his panicked eyes. "Dad," he said, his voice tight, "I thought you were resting. You know the doctor said you need your sleep." I took a sip of the champagne. It was cheap. Preston was cutting costs on the catering too. "I felt energized, son," I replied, looking past him at the investors. "It would be rude of me not to welcome your guests. After all, I have been away on a government-sponsored sabbatical for quite some time." A nervous ripple of laughter went through the room. Preston grabbed my elbow, his fingers digging into my arm. "Go back upstairs," he hissed in my ear. "You are ruining this." Before I could answer, Tiffany stepped forward. She had composed herself. She saw the investors watching, and she saw an opportunity. She released Preston's arm and walked toward me with a look of exaggerated pity. She placed a hand on my chest, her fingers splayed like a spider. "Oh, Harlan," she sighed loud enough for everyone to hear. "It is so brave of you to come down. We were just telling everyone how much you have struggled since the incident." She let the word hang in the air. The incident. The code word for the lie that had sent me to prison. The room went deadly silent. The investors leaned in, hungry for the gossip. Tiffany turned to the crowd, her eyes shimmering with fake tears. "You all know the tragedy our family faced," she said, her voice trembling perfectly. "When I lost the baby. It was a dark time. And poor Harlan here. His mind just snapped. He did not mean to hurt me. We know that now. Prison was hard on him, but we are just glad to have him back where we can take care of him, even if he gets confused sometimes." She patted my cheek condescendingly. It was a masterclass in humiliation. In 30 seconds, she had painted me as a violent, senile old man and herself as the saintly victim who had forgiven him. The investors nodded sympathetically. They looked at me with pity. I did not pull away. I let her hand rest on my cheek. I looked her dead in the eye. You are right, Tiffany, I said, my voice calm and steady. My memory has been foggy lately. Prison does that to a man. You have so much time to think about the past, to replay every detail. I took a step closer to her, forcing her to step back. But there is one thing I have been trying to remember. I continued addressing the room now. And maybe you can help me, Tiffany, since you were there. I paused. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. That night on the stairs, I said, when you fell, and we lost the baby, was it a boy or a girl? Tiffany froze. Her smile faltered. What she stammered. The baby, I repeated innocently. I never saw the certificate. Preston never told me. Was I going to have a grandson or a granddaughter? Tiffany looked at Preston. Preston looked at his shoes. It was a boy, she said quickly. A little boy. We were going to name him after Preston. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a napkin. A boy, I said, nodding slowly. That is beautiful. A son. I took another sip of champagne and then lowered the glass. That is strange, though. I reached into the inside pocket of my tuxedo. I pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was not the original medical report, but they did not know that. It was just a laundry list from the prison. But I held it like it was a death sentence. Because my lawyer sent me the medical files from St. Jude's Hospital just yesterday, I said, my voice dropping an octave. I wanted to have a memorial service, you see, to pay my respects. But the pathology report from the night of the miscarriage, it does not mention a male fetus. I unfolded the paper slowly. The rustling sound was the only noise in the room. In fact, I read from the paper. It says the patient was treated for a ruptured ovarian cyst, a painful condition certainly, but not a pregnancy, and definitely not a baby boy named Preston. I looked up. Tiffany's face had drained of all color. She looked like a corpse in a red dress. The guests were exchanging glances. Whispers started to break out. A man in the back, a banker I recognized, frowned and looked at Preston. What is he talking about? Preston, the banker asked. You told us the litigation risk was over. You told us the assault charge was solid. Preston panicked. He looked at Tiffany, who was shaking her head frantically. He looked at the investors who were starting to back away. He is confused, Preston shouted, his voice cracking. I told you he is senile. He does not know what he is reading. That is probably a grocery list. He grabbed Tiffany's arm roughly, almost dragging her off her feet. Tiffany is tired, he announced to the room. Ideally, she needs to rest. The emotional trauma. You understand. Dad, give me that paper. He tried to snatch the paper from my hand, but I pulled it back. I folded it neatly and placed it back in my pocket. Trauma is a terrible thing, I said coolly. It makes people say and do crazy things. Get some rest, Tiffany. You look like you have seen a ghost. Preston glared at me with pure hatred, but he could not do anything. Not in front of the money. He pulled Tiffany toward the kitchen door, abandoning his own party. I stood there alone in the center of the room. The circle of people around me had widened. They were not looking at me with pity anymore. They were looking at me with fear, and they were looking at the door where Preston had just fled with suspicion. I raised my glass to the banker who had asked the question. The scallops are excellent, I said, but I would stay away from the investment portfolio if I were you. The numbers are just as imaginary as my grandson. I turned and walked toward the buffet table. I did not need to look back to know that the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were already starting to take root. The party was effectively over, and the real show was just beginning. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 o'clock in the morning. The sound reverberated through the silent house like a death knell. The party was over. The last of the drunk investors and sycophants had stumbled out the door an hour ago, leaving behind the smell of stale cigar smoke and spilled wine. The house was quiet now, but it was not at peace. It was holding its breath. I sat on the edge of the guest bed in the dark. I had not changed out of my tuxedo. I had not slept. Sleep is a luxury for the innocent, and I was neither innocent nor naive. In my hand, I held the small receiver that paired with the bug I had planted under the desk earlier that evening. I adjusted the volume and pressed the earpiece into my ear. The audio feed was crystal clear. It picked up the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the ticking of the clock. But then I heard voices. They were in the living room right where I knew they would be. Preston sounded drunk. His words were slurring, running together in a pathetic stream of anxiety. He knows, Tiff. I am telling you, he knows. Did you see the way he looked at you? Did you hear what he said about the medical report? There was the sound of glass clinking against a table. Tiffany's voice cut through the static, sharp and cold. She did not sound drunk. She sounded calculating. He is guessing, Preston. He is throwing darts in the dark, hoping to hit something. The medical report is buried. I paid the nurse to shred the hard copies. The digital file is encrypted. He has nothing. But he has the dates, Preston whined. He has the dates wrong. He said the cyst surgery was 2 days before the fall. So what? Tiffany snapped. He is an old man who spent 2 years in a concrete box. No one believes him. You saw the investors. They think he is losing his mind. Stop drinking and focus. I listened as the leather sofa creaked. Preston was pacing. I could imagine him sweating, pulling at his collar, just like he did when he was a boy and had broken a window. We need more cash, Preston said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The loan from Nemesis. The interest payment is due next week. I spent the principal on the crypto margin call. We are underwater, Tiff. If we miss the payment, we lose the voting rights. I leaned forward in the dark. This was it. The confession. Then sell more shares, Tiffany said casually, as if she were suggesting ordering pizza. Sell the Asian distribution arm. We have an offer on the table. I cannot, Preston groaned. That is the core of the business. If I sell that, Dad has no say. Tiffany interrupted, her voice rising. Dad is a ghost. You are the CEO. And listen to me, Preston. I need $50,000 by Friday. 50,000. Preston choked. For what? I just gave you 10 grand last week. Leo needs things, Tiffany said. Her voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of a wife. It was the voice of a blackmailer. The nanny needs to be paid. The private doctor needs to be paid. And I need security. If this ship goes down, Preston, I am not going down with it. You better find the money. Or maybe I will take Leo and go stay with my brother for a while. You know how much the press would love a story about a single mother fleeing a bankrupt CEO. Silence. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She was using the child not as a son, but as a hostage. Fine, Preston whispered, defeated. I will call the broker in the morning. I will sell the shares. Just do not leave. I took the earpiece out. My hand was shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, focused fury. They were going to dismantle my life's work to pay for her greed and his incompetence. I stood up. The floorboards were cold under my bare feet. I had heard enough. It was time to stop being a listener and start being a hunter. I opened the bedroom door. The hallway was pitched in darkness. The only light came from the moon filtering through the high windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. I knew this house better than I knew the back of my own hand. I knew which floorboards creaked. I knew which doors drifted open if they were not latched. I moved silently, a phantom in my own home. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down into the foyer. It was empty. The living room was dark. Preston must have passed out on the sofa or stumbled up the back stairs. But then I saw it. A faint beam of light flickering in the hallway that led to my old study. Someone was there. I descended the stairs, my weight shifting effortlessly, avoiding the center of the steps where the wood was old. I reached the ground floor and pressed my back against the wall. I waited. I listened. Click, click, click. Beep. The sound of a keypad. I moved closer. The door to the study was slightly ajar. I peered through the crack. The beam of a flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the far wall. The mirrors that lined the room reflected the light, creating a disorienting maze of beams. But in the center of it all was Tiffany. She was kneeling in front of the wall where Beatrice's portrait usually hung. But she had moved the painting. Behind it, revealed in the wall, was my private safe. The one I had installed 30 years ago. The one that held not money, but secrets, deeds, original incorporation papers, and the physical evidence of my private investigations. She was punching numbers into the keypad frantically. 1980, beep, error, 1985, beep, error. Damn it, she hissed under her breath. She hit the safe with the palm of her hand. Come on, you old fool, what is the code? She was trying my birth year. She was trying Preston's birth year. She thought I was sentimental. She thought I was predictable. I watched her for a moment. She looked desperate. Her hair was messy, the red dress rumpled. The mask of the perfect socialite had slipped completely, revealing the common thief underneath. She punched in another code. 2021. The year I went to prison. Beep, error. The red light on the safe blinked, mocking her. System locked. Wait 5 minutes. She let out a low growl of frustration and rested her forehead against the cold steel of the safe door. It is not going to open, Tiffany, I said. My voice was low, hardly more than a whisper, but in the silence of the room it sounded like a gunshot. Tiffany screamed. It was a sharp, terrified sound that cut off abruptly as she spun around. She dropped the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, the beam spinning wildly until it came to rest, illuminating my polished black shoes. I stood in the doorway, shrouded in shadow. I did not move. I did not blink. Who is there? She gasped, backing up until she hit the wall. I stepped forward into the pool of light. The reflection in the mirrors multiplied me so that suddenly she was surrounded by a dozen versions of me, all staring at her with the same cold judgment. It is the ghost, I said. Harlan, she breathed, her hand clutching her chest. You scared me to death. What are you doing sneaking around in the dark? I walked slowly into the room. I picked up the flashlight and shone it on her face. She squinted blindingly, holding up a hand to shield her eyes. I live here, remember, I said, calm and deadly. I could ask you the same thing. It is 3 a.m, and you are trying to break into a safe that does not belong to you. I was looking for my earrings, she lied quickly, her eyes darting around the room. I think I left them in here when I was working out. I thought maybe I put them in the safe for safekeeping. I laughed. A dry, humorless sound. You do not know the code, Tiffany, I said. You never did. And even if you did, that safe is empty of what you are looking for. There is no cash in there. I moved the liquid assets years ago. I took another step closer. She was trapped between me and the treadmill. So tell me the truth, I said, lowering the light so it cast deep shadows across her face. What were you really looking for? I leaned in close enough to smell the stale champagne on her breath. Were you looking for the deed to the house, I asked? Or maybe you were looking for something else? I paused, letting the silence stretch until she began to tremble. Were you looking for proof of your affair from 2 years ago? I whispered. Her eyes went wide. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and sickly in the harsh light. What are you talking about? She stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. The personal trainer, I said. The one with the tattoo on his neck. The one you were seeing while Preston was at work. The one who was actually driving the motorcycle when you had your accident. Tiffany shook her head violently. "You are lying," she shrieked, but it was a scream of panic, not outrage. "You are crazy." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the earpiece. I held it up. "I hear everything, Tiffany," I said. "I hear the demands for money. I hear the threats to leave. And now I see the thief in the night." I clicked the flashlight off, plunging the room back into darkness. "Run along to bed, my dear," I said from the blackness. "And lock your door. Not to keep me out, but because when Preston finds out what I know, he might be the one you need to worry about." I heard a sob escape her throat. Then the sound of her bare feet slapping against the floor as she ran past me out of the room and up the stairs. She ran as if the devil himself was at her heels. I stood alone in the dark gym. I walked over to the safe. I punched in the code, 730, the number of days I spent in prison. The safe beeped green and clicked open. I reached inside and pulled out a single manila envelope. It was thick. It was heavy. I closed the safe. "Sleep tight, Tiffany," I whispered. "Tomorrow, the nightmare begins for real." The next morning, I took a cab to the south side of the city. I did not ask Garrett to drive me because there are some places a shiny black sedan simply does not belong. The neighborhood was a graveyard of industry. Empty factories with broken windows stood like skeletons against the gray sky. The streets were lined with potholes and piles of uncollected trash. This was where my son had banished his own family while he lived in the lap of luxury. I pulled my hat low over my eyes and walked into a diner called the Rusty Spoon. The air inside smelled of stale grease and burnt coffee. The linoleum floor was cracked and the vinyl seats were taped together with duct tape. I sat in a booth in the back corner where the shadows were deepest. I did not have to look at the menu. I just watched the woman behind the counter. Sarah looked 10 years older than the last time I had seen her. Her strawberry blonde hair, which used to shine, was pulled back in a messy bun. Her uniform was stained and too big for her thin frame. She was moving with the frantic energy of someone who is terrified of losing their job. She poured coffee for a truck driver who grabbed her wrist and said something that made her flinch. She pulled away, forcing a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. My heart broke. This was the woman who had made my son a better man. The woman who had given me a grandson. And she was being treated like cattle. I waited until the lunch rush died down. When she finally came over to my table with a pot of coffee, she did not look at me. She was looking at her notepad. "What can I get for you, hun?" she asked, her voice raspy with fatigue. "Hello, Sarah," I said. She froze. The pot of coffee trembled in her hand, splashing a few hot drops onto the table. She looked up slowly, and when her eyes met mine, I saw pure, unadulterated terror. She took a step back, clutching the pot like a weapon. "Harlan," she whispered. "Oh, God. Please. I do not have any money." She thought I was there to hurt her. She thought I was the monster Preston had told the world I was. "Sit down, Sarah," I said softly, gesturing to the seat opposite me. "Please. I am not here to hurt you." She looked around the diner, checking if her manager was watching. Then she slid into the booth, sitting on the edge of the seat, ready to run. "They said you were in prison," she said, her hands shaking on the table. "They said you would never get out." "I was released yesterday," I said. "And the first thing I wanted to do was see you. And the boy. How is Danny?" At the mention of her son, her expression hardened. She leaned forward, her protective instinct overriding her fear. "Stay away from him," she hissed. "Preston made it very clear. If I try to contact the family, or if I let you near Danny, he will cut off the alimony. He will take full custody. He told me you are dangerous, Harlan. He told me what you did to Tiffany." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. She tried to pull away, but I held firm. My grip was gentle but solid. I did not touch Tiffany, I said, looking deep into her eyes. I never touched her. And I know you did not cheat on Preston either. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She slumped back against the booth, the fight draining out of her. It does not matter what is true, she said, wiping her eyes with a rough paper napkin. It only matters what they can prove. Tiffany is smart, Harlan. Evil, but smart. She hired that actor. She set up the hotel room. She called me there saying it was a catering emergency for Preston's company. When I walked in, that man grabbed me and the photographer jumped out of the closet. She looked out the window at the bleak street outside. Preston did not even ask for an explanation. She continued, her voice bitter. He had the divorce papers ready the next morning. He kicked us out with nothing. He said Danny probably was not even his. He cut off my credit cards. He blocked my number. We lived in a shelter for 3 months, Harlan. A shelter. While he was buying Tiffany a Porsche. I felt the rage rising again, hot and familiar. But I pushed it down. Rage is useless unless it is focused. I know, Sarah, I said. I know everything. I know about the fake miscarriage. I know about the embezzlement. And I know that Danny is the only true heir to the Ford name. Sarah looked at me sadly. So what she said? You are just an old man with a criminal record. And I am a waitress living in a 1-bedroom apartment with rats in the walls. We cannot fight them, Harlan. They have lawyers. They have money. If we try, they will crush us. Please, just go. Leave us alone before Preston finds out you were here. She started to slide out of the booth. I am not asking you to fight Sarah, I said. She stopped. I reached into my jacket pocket. I did not pull out a weapon. I pulled out the file. The Nemesis file. I slid it across the sticky table. Open it, I commanded. Sarah hesitated, then opened the folder. She looked at the documents. She saw the loan agreement. She saw the default clauses. She saw the name of the holding company. Nemesis Corp. I do not understand, she said, looking up at me confused. What is this? This is the end of Preston Ford, I said. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice. I am Nemesis Sarah. I own the debt. I own the mortgage on the mansion. I own the company's operating capital. I own them. Her eyes went wide as she processed what I was saying. You lent him the money, she stammered. I gave him the shovel I corrected. And he dug his own grave. But I need one thing to bury him. I need a witness. I pointed to the documents in her hand. I can take his money, I said. I can take his house. But I need you to help me take his freedom. I need you to testify about the setup. I need you to tell the judge exactly how Tiffany orchestrated the divorce. I have the medical records proving her miscarriage was a lie. If we combine that with your testimony, we can prove a pattern of fraud. We can put them where they belong. Sarah looked down at her hands. They were red and chapped from scrubbing tables. I am scared, Harlan, she whispered. Preston threatened me. He said he would make sure I never work in this town again. I reached into my pocket again. This time I pulled out a check. I had written it that morning from the Nemesis operating account. It was for $50,000. This is for you, I said, sliding it on top of the file. It is a consulting fee. Use it to get a decent apartment. Get Danny some new clothes. Quit this job today. Sarah stared at the check. Her mouth fell open. Harlan was... I cannot take this. It is not a gift, I said sternly. It is an advance. When we win, you will be managing the Ford Foundation. You will never have to serve another cup of coffee in your life. But you have to be brave. Not for me, for Danny. Do you want him to grow up in this neighborhood? Or do you want him to grow up in the house his grandfather built? Sarah looked at the check, then at the file, then at me. I saw the change happen in her eyes. The fear was still there, but something else was pushing through it. Hope. And a mother's fierce desire for justice. She took a deep breath. She picked up the check and held it tight. "He told me I was worthless," she said, her voice shaking, but gaining strength. "He told me I was nothing without him." "He was wrong," I said. Sarah nodded. She stood up. She took off her apron and threw it onto the table. It landed with a soft thud. "I get off at 2, she said. "Where do we start?" I smiled. "We start by getting you a lawyer," I said, "and then we start the fire." I watched her walk behind the counter and tell her manager she was quitting. For the first time in 2 years, I felt a genuine warmth in my chest. I had my ally. I had my family. And Preston and Tiffany were sitting in their glass castle, completely unaware that the stones were about to start flying. The headquarters of Ford Logistics rose above the city skyline like a monument of steel and glass. I stood on the sidewalk across the street, looking up at the 42nd floor. That was where my office used to be. That was where I had signed the papers to buy my first fleet of trucks. And that was where my son was currently sitting, preparing to sell the last piece of my soul to a consortium of foreign investors who only cared about stripping the assets and firing the American workforce. I adjusted my tie in the reflection of the glass doors. I was not wearing the loose suit from yesterday. I was wearing a charcoal pinstripe tailored to perfection. It was old, but it commanded respect. I walked toward the revolving doors. My heart was pounding not with fear, but with the rhythm of a war drum. The lobby smelled the same, lemon polish and filtered air. The receptionist was new. She was young, and she looked at me with a mixture of confusion and recognition. She reached for the phone, probably to warn Preston, but I held up a hand. I did not stop walking. I headed straight for the security turnstiles. Standing there was Sam. He was the head of security. A big man with shoulders like a linebacker and a heart of gold. I had paid for his daughter's knee surgery 10 years ago. He looked at me and his face softened. He glanced at the monitor, where a memo with my face on it was undoubtedly pinned under the title "Do Not Admit." Sam stepped forward, blocking my path. To anyone watching on the cameras, it looked like he was doing his job. He leaned in close, his hand resting on his belt. "Mr. Ford," he rumbled, his voice low, "they told me to call the police if you showed up. They said you were dangerous." I looked Sam in the eye. "Do I look dangerous, Sam?" I asked. He smiled a small, sad smile. "You look like the boss to me," he whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a keycard. He swiped it on the sensor for me. The gate beeped green and opened. "Give them hell, sir," Sam said, stepping aside. I nodded my thanks and walked to the private elevator. The doors slid shut, cocooning me in silence. As the numbers above the door climbed higher, 20, 30, I felt the weight of the last 2 years falling away. I was rising. I was returning. The elevator chimed at the 42nd floor. The doors opened directly into the executive lobby. The boardroom was straight ahead. The double glass doors were frosted, but I could see the silhouettes of the people inside. I could hear Preston's voice. It was high-pitched and fast, the voice of a man trying to sell a drowning horse. I walked up to the doors. I did not knock. I pushed them open with both hands and stepped inside. The room went silent instantly. There were 12 people sitting around the massive oval table. 6 of them were the foreign investors, men in expensive suits with unreadable expressions. 4 were the remaining board members, cronies Preston had appointed. And at the head of the table stood Preston. He was pointing at a graph on the projection screen that showed a projected profit from the liquidation. He froze his hand still in the air. He looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost. "Security!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "How did you get in here?" Sam, get up here." I walked calmly to the other end of the table opposite him. I placed my briefcase on the mahogany surface with a heavy thud. "Sam is busy," I said, my voice filling the room. "And this meeting is illegal." Preston turned purple. "Get out!" he screamed. "You have no authority here. You are a convicted felon. You were removed from the board. You have 0 shares, 0 voting rights. You are nobody." The lead investor, a man with gray hair and cold eyes, looked from Preston to me. He did not look amused. "Mr. Ford," he said, addressing Preston, "is this going to be a problem? We were assured that the family issues were resolved." "They are resolved," Preston stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "My father is suffering from delusions. He has no legal standing. We can proceed with the vote. I hold 51% of the voting stock. I authorize the sale." He looked at the board members. "Vote," he commanded. "Raise your hands. Sell the division." I reached into my briefcase. "Before you raise your hands," I said loud enough to stop them, "you might want to check your math, Preston." I pulled out a stack of papers. They were not crisp legal documents drafted by a high-priced firm. They were crinkled. Some had coffee stains. Some were handwritten. "You are right," I continued. "I do not have any shares. You stole them all, but you forgot about the employee stock ownership plan." Preston laughed nervously. "The ESOP," he scoffed. "Those represent tiny fractions. The drivers, the mechanics, the secretaries. They have no power. They are irrelevant." I spread the papers out on the table, fanning them like a deck of cards. "You are wrong, son," I said. "They are the company. And for the last 24 hours, while you were planning your gala and buying your wife jewelry, I was visiting them. I went to the break rooms. I went to the loading docks. I went to the mechanic shops. I picked up one of the sheets. This is a proxy form signed by Dave Miller, the head mechanic. He has been fixing our trucks for 30 years. This one is from Mrs. Higgins, your old executive assistant, whom you fired last month. This one is from the entire union chapter of the Northeast Division." I looked at the investors. These people own shares. Small shares, yes. But when you add them all up, they amount to 15% of the total voting stock. And guess what? They all signed their voting rights over to me for this meeting. Preston's face went pale. He began to do the mental math. If he had sold 40% to pay his debts, and he needed a supermajority to authorize a sale of this magnitude, my 15% was a brick wall. "I hold the proxy for 15% of this company," I announced. "And on behalf of the men and women who actually built this business, I vote no." The room was deathly quiet. The lead investor closed his folder. He stood up. "Mr. Ford," he said to Preston, "it seems you do not have the authorization you claimed. We do not do business with liars." He signaled to his team. They stood up in unison and walked out of the room. They did not even look at Preston as they passed him. The door clicked shut behind them. Preston stood there trembling. His big deal was dead. His liquidity was gone. The investors had walked. He looked at me with eyes full of madness. He grabbed a heavy crystal water glass from the table. "You old bastard!" he screamed. He hurled the glass across the room. It missed my head by inches and shattered against the wall behind me, exploding into 1,000 shards. Water dripped down the expensive wallpaper like tears. "You ruined it!" Preston shrieked. "That was $12 million. That was our lifeline. Do you know what you have done? You have killed us. You want us to starve. Is that it? You want your own family to be out on the street." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I looked at the shattered glass, then back at him. "I do not want you to starve, Preston," I said calmly, picking up my briefcase. "I want you to work. There is a difference." I turned my back on him and walked toward the door. "And Preston," I added, pausing with my hand on the handle, "fix the wall. It is coming out of your salary." I walked out, leaving him screaming in the wreckage of his own greed. The battle for the boardroom was won. But the war for the soul of my family was far from over. I had stopped the bleeding, but now it was time to perform the surgery. And surgery is always painful. The private medical practice of Dr. Elias Thorne was located in a glass building that looked more like a five-star hotel than a clinic. The waiting room was decorated with abstract art and smelled of lavender and money. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that costs $500 an hour. I walked past the receptionist, a young woman who was too busy typing on her phone to notice two men in suits walking briskly toward the private offices. Garrett tried to catch my eye, looking nervous, but I kept my gaze fixed on the mahogany door at the end of the hall. The nameplate read, Dr. Elias Thorne, Chief of Obstetrics. To the world, he was a respected specialist. To me, he was the man who had sold my freedom for a check. I did not knock. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. Dr. Thorne was sitting behind a desk that was almost as big as mine used to be. He was a handsome man in his 50s, with a deep tan and silver hair that was perfectly coiffed. He was on the phone laughing at something the person on the other end had said. When he saw us, his laughter died in his throat. He lowered the phone slowly and ended the call. "Who let you in here?" he asked, his voice smooth but edged with irritation. "I am with a patient." I looked around the empty room. I do not see a patient. "Doctor," I said, closing the door behind me and locking it with a soft click. "I see a businessman, and I am here to negotiate a deal." Thorne stood up. He recognized me. I saw the flash of recognition in his eyes, followed immediately by a flash of panic. But he covered it well. He smoothed the front of his white coat. "Mr. Ford," he said, his tone turning condescending. "I heard you were released. I assume this intrusion is due to some lingering confusion from your time away. If you leave now, I will not call the police. If you stay, I will have you arrested for harassment. Again." I walked to the leather chair opposite his desk and sat down. I crossed my legs and dusted a piece of imaginary lint from my trousers. "Call them," I said calmly. Thorne paused, his hand hovering over the intercom button. "Excuse me," he said. "Call the police," I repeated. "In fact, I insist. I would love to have a conversation with the authorities, especially the fraud division. I think they would be very interested in your offshore accounts, specifically the one in the Cayman Islands that received a deposit of $50,000 2 years ago. On the exact same day you signed the affidavit stating that my daughter-in-law miscarried due to blunt force trauma." Thorne froze. His finger retreated from the button. He sat back down slowly, his eyes narrowing. "I do not know what you are talking about," he said. "My finances are private, and my medical opinions are based on science, not bribery." I nodded to Garrett. My lawyer stepped forward and opened his briefcase. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and placed it gently on the desk. It was a transaction record. It showed the wire transfer from a shell company registered to Tiffany St. Clair directly into an account named Esculapius Holdings. "That is your holding company, isn't it?" Dr. Garrett asked. "We traced the registration. It leads right back to this address." Thorne looked at the paper. A bead of sweat appeared on his forehead near his hairline. He wiped it away quickly. "This proves nothing," he spat. "Patients pay for privacy. That was a consulting fee." "For what?" I asked, leaning forward. "Consulting on how to frame an innocent man. Consulting on how to fake a pregnancy loss." Thorne slammed his hand on the desk. "Get out," he shouted, losing his composure. "You have no proof of anything. That affidavit was accurate. She came in bleeding. She had bruising consistent with a fall. I treated her. I documented it. You cannot intimidate me, Ford. I have friends on the medical board. I have lawyers who will eat you alive." I stayed silent. I let his anger fill the room. I let him scream until he ran out of breath. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out a second piece of paper. This one was a photo. It was a grainy image taken from a traffic camera. It was dated May 14th, 2 years ago, 2 hours before Tiffany supposedly fell down the stairs at my house. The photo showed a motorcycle lying on its side on a wet highway. A man was standing over it looking at the damage, and sitting on the curb, clutching her stomach, was a woman. Her helmet was off. It was Tiffany. I slid the photo across the desk. This was taken 5 miles from the city center, I said. It was a single vehicle accident. The police report says the driver lost control on a slick patch of road. The passenger refused medical treatment at the scene. She said she would go to her own doctor. I pointed at Thorne. She came to you, didn't she? Thorne stared at the photo. His face went pale. She came to you injured, I continued, my voice relentless. She was bleeding. She was in pain. But she wasn't hurt because she fell down my stairs. She was hurt because she was on the back of a bike with her lover. And she knew that if Preston found out she had been reckless, if he found out she was with another man, she would lose everything. The prenup would have left her with nothing. Thorne did not speak. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting between the photo and the door. So she made a plan, I said. She called you, she paid you, she told you to write it up as a domestic accident. She went home, waited for me to argue with her, and then threw herself down a few carpeted steps to match the bruising she already had. It was the perfect crime. Except for one thing. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. The baby. Thorne looked up at me. His eyes were wide with fear. There was no baby, I said. Was there? Thorne licked his lips. He looked at Garrett, who was holding a pen and a legal pad ready to write. Then he looked back at me. He saw the resolve in my eyes. He saw that I was not bluffing. He saw the end of his career. If I tell you, he whispered, his voice trembling, if I tell you the truth, will you keep me out of it? I cannot go to jail, Harlan. I have a family. I have a reputation. I do not care about your reputation, I said coldly, but I do care about my own. You help me clear my name, and I will ask the district attorney for leniency. I will tell them you cooperated. It is the best deal you are going to get. If you refuse, I walk out of here and I give this photo and that bank statement to the press. You will be destroyed by morning. Thorne slumped in his chair. He looked small. He looked defeated. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. She was never pregnant, he said softly. Garrett began to write furiously. Say that again, I commanded. Louder. Thorne looked up, his eyes red. She was never pregnant with Preston's child, he said. She had a cyst. An ovarian cyst that had been causing her pain for months. She refused to get it treated because she was trying to get pregnant to secure her marriage. But she couldn't. And the accident, I asked. The accident ruptured the cyst, he confessed. That was the bleeding. That was the pain. She came to me terrified. She told me she had been with a friend. She said Preston would kill her if he knew. She begged me to help her. She said if I just wrote that it was a miscarriage, she could blame it on the fall. She said it would solve all her problems. She offered me $50,000. I had gambling debts. I took the money. I felt a wave of nausea. 2 years of my life. 2 years in a cage. All because of a cyst and a lie. And the stairs, I asked. She did that herself, he said, shaking his head. She staged it. She wanted to get rid of you. She said you were asking too many questions about the finances. She said you were in the way. It was 2 birds with 1 stone. I sat back in the chair. I felt lightheaded. The truth was uglier than I had imagined. It wasn't just greed. It was pure malice. Write it down, I said. What? Thorne asked. Write a full confession, I said, pointing to his notepad. Detail everything. The cyst, the accident, the bribe, the fake diagnosis, and sign it. Thorne hesitated for a second, then grabbed his pen. He wrote for 10 minutes. The only sound in the room was the scratching of the pen on paper and his ragged breathing. When he was finished, he pushed the pad toward me. I read it. It was damning. It was perfect. I stood up. I took the notepad and handed it to Garrett. "We need this notarized," I told Garrett, "and we need a copy sent to the district attorney immediately." I looked down at Thorne. He was sitting with his head in his hands. "You are a disgrace to your profession," I said. "I know," he whispered. I walked to the door and unlocked it. "Do not leave town, doctor," I said. "The police will be coming for you. But at least now you have a chance to tell them you were coerced. It might save you a few years." I walked out of the office and down the hall. Garrett walked beside me, clutching the notepad like it was the Holy Grail. "We got him," Garrett said, his voice full of awe. "We actually got him." "We got the pawn," I said, staring straight ahead. "Now we go for the queen." I walked out of the building and into the sunlight. The air felt cleaner. The city noise sounded like music. I had the weapon I needed. The noose was tightening around Tiffany's neck. And tomorrow I would kick the chair out from under her. The grand ballroom of the city museum was a spectacle of excess. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen fireworks, casting a golden glow over the city's elite. There were 500 guests tonight. Men in tuxedos who controlled the city's banks, and women in gowns that cost more than a teacher's annual salary. They were drinking vintage champagne and eating caviar, oblivious to the fact that they were standing in a slaughterhouse, and the pig being led to the slaughter was my son. I stood in the shadows of the velvet curtains, stage right. I was invisible to the crowd, but I had a perfect view of the podium. Preston was up there, basking in the spotlight. He looked the part of the successful CEO. His hair was perfectly styled. His smile was bright and false. Tiffany sat in the front row, wearing a necklace that I recognized as another piece from my late wife's collection. She was clapping her hands, gazing up at him with a look of adoration that I knew evaporated the moment the cameras turned off. Preston leaned into the microphone. His voice boomed through the hall, confident and smooth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, spreading his arms wide, "tonight is not just about raising money for the arts. It is about legacy. My father, Harlan Ford, built a great foundation. But the future belongs to innovation. The future belongs to those brave enough to take risks. And I am proud to announce that Ford Logistics is entering a new era of prosperity. We are expanding, we are growing, and we are stronger than ever." I checked my watch. It was 8 o'clock exactly. The timing was crucial. At that exact moment, across the city and across the globe, the automated press release from Nemesis Corporation hit the newswires. Simultaneously, the foreclosure notice was filed electronically with the county clerk, and most importantly, the notification was pushed to the financial apps on every smartphone in the room. It started as a ripple. A phone chimed in the back of the room. Then another. Then a pocket buzzed against a thigh. Then a purse vibrated against a chair leg. Within 10 seconds, the low murmur of polite attention was replaced by a strange digital hum. The sound of 500 devices receiving bad news at the same time. Preston faltered. He noticed the shift in the room. He saw the head of the Commerce Bank look down at his phone and frown. He saw the mayor whisper something to his wife and point at the stage. "We are," Preston stammered, trying to regain control. "We are committed to excellence." But nobody was listening to him anymore. The screens of their phones were glowing, lighting up faces with the blue hue of shock. The headline was short and brutal. Ford Logistics defaults. Nemesis Corp seizes control. Assets frozen. Bankruptcy imminent. The whispering started. It grew louder like the buzzing of angry bees. I saw a woman in the second row show her phone to Tiffany. Tiffany looked at the screen. I saw her jaw drop. She stood up, knocking her chair over. She looked at Preston with wide, terrified eyes and shook her head frantically. Preston looked confused. He laughed nervously, a high-pitched sound that echoed painfully in the microphone. Is there a problem?" he asked. I stepped out from the curtains. I did not run. I walked. My footsteps were heavy and deliberate on the wooden stage. I walked up behind Preston. He did not see me until the crowd gasped. He turned around and jumped back as if I had burned him. "Dad," he whispered. "What are you doing here?" "Get off the stage." I reached out and took the microphone from his hand. He was too stunned to resist. I gripped the stand and looked out at the sea of faces. I saw the shock. I saw the judgment. And I saw the realization dawning on them that the king was dead and the old lion had returned. "Good evening, everyone," I said. My voice was calm, cold, and steady. "I apologize for the interruption. My son was just telling you about the future of Ford Logistics. But it seems he left out a few critical details about the present." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the deed. The real deed. The one transferred to Nemesis Corporation 5 minutes ago. "You all just received a notification on your phones," I continued. "It says that Ford Logistics has defaulted on a major loan. It says that a company called Nemesis Corporation has exercised its right to seize all assets, including the corporate headquarters, the fleet, and the executive voting rights." I paused, letting the words sink in. That is all true. But there is one detail the news report missed. It did not mention who owns Nemesis Corporation. I turned to look at Preston. He was shaking. His face was the color of ash. He was putting the pieces together. The loan, the trap, the man standing before him. "I own it," I said, looking back at the crowd. A collective gasp went through the room. "I am Nemesis," I declared, my voice rising. "I am the creditor. I am the bank. And as of 8:01 this evening, I am the sole owner of Ford Logistics." Preston grabbed my arm. "You cannot do this," he hissed. "That loan, that was private equity. You tricked me." I pulled my arm away. "I did not trick you, son. I tested you, and you failed. You bet the company on a lie. You leveraged my legacy to pay for your wife's greed, and now the bill is due." I looked down at Tiffany in the front row. She was freezing. She looked ready to run, but there was nowhere to go. "And there is one more thing," I said, speaking into the microphone. "The collateral for the loan included all personal assets pledged by the guarantor. That means the cars, that means the accounts, and that means the house." I pointed at Preston. "This gala is over. The company is under new management, and my son is officially homeless." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a guillotine blade hanging in the air. Preston snapped. The humiliation was too much. The loss of his status, his money, his identity in front of the people he desperately wanted to impress, broke something inside him. He let out a primal scream of rage. "You stole it!" he shrieked. "You thief! I will kill you!" He lunged at me. His hands were clawed, reaching for my throat. He wanted to squeeze the life out of me right there on stage. I did not move. I did not flinch. I stood my ground, prepared to take the hit, but I did not have to. From the wings, a massive figure emerged. It was Sam, the head of security. He moved faster than a man his size should be able to move. He intercepted Preston in midair, tackling him to the ground with a bone-jarring thud. "Get off me!" Preston screamed, thrashing against the floor like a wild animal. "That is my company. He is the criminal. Arrest him." Sam pinned Preston's arms behind his back. He looked up at me, awaiting orders. "Take him out, Sam," I said quietly into the microphone. and take his wife too. They are trespassing. Two other guards appeared and grabbed Tiffany, who was trying to slip away through the side exit. She screamed, kicking and scratching as they dragged her toward the doors. Preston was hauled to his feet. His tuxedo was torn. His hair was wild. He looked at me with eyes full of tears and hatred. "I am your son," he sobbed. "How could you do this?" I looked at him. I looked at the boy I had raised, who had grown into a man who would frame his own father. "You stopped being my son the day you put me in a cage," I said. "Get him out of my sight." Sam dragged him away. Preston's screams echoed through the ballroom until the heavy double doors slammed shut, cutting off the sound. I stood alone on the stage. The crowd was staring at me. They were terrified. They were awestruck. They were witnessing a massacre and a coronation all at once. I adjusted my tie. I looked at the microphone. "Please enjoy the dessert," I said. "I believe the chocolate tart is excellent." I placed the microphone back on the stand and walked off the stage. I did not look back. I had stripped him of his armor. I had taken his sword. Now he was naked in the wilderness. But I was not done. He had lost his money. But he still had his freedom. And that was the last thing I intended to take. The backstage area was a narrow corridor of concrete and exposed wiring that smelled of dust and old adrenaline. It was the unglamorous reality behind the velvet curtain, and it was fitting that this was where my family finally disintegrated. The roar of the crowd in the ballroom had turned into a low, confused rumble, but back here the noise was sharp and violent. Sam and the other guards had dragged Preston into a holding area near the loading dock. He was disheveled, his tuxedo jacket torn at the shoulder, his face slick with sweat and tears. He was not fighting anymore. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal looking for a way out. Tiffany was there too, cornered by two security officers who were politely but firmly blocking her path to the exit. I walked into the space, the heavy metal door clicking shut behind me, muting the noise from the gala. But I was not alone. The press had found the side entrance. A dozen reporters with cameras and microphones were pushing against the security line, their lenses hungry for the aftermath of the explosion I had just detonated on stage. I nodded to Sam to let them in. The truth needed an audience. Preston saw me and scrambled to his feet, stumbling toward Tiffany. He reached out for her, desperate for an ally, desperate for the woman he had sacrificed his soul to please. "Tiffany, tell them," Preston pleaded, his voice high and hysterical. "Tell them about the trust. Tell them about the baby's rights. He cannot take everything. We still have your accounts. We still have the offshore money." Tiffany slapped his hand away. The sound echoed off the concrete walls like a gunshot. She stepped back, looking at him with a mixture of disgust and pure, unadulterated loathing. The mask had fallen completely now. There was no more sweet, supportive wife. There was only a rat realizing the ship had sunk and the captain was drowning. "Do not touch me," she spat. "You are pathetic. Look at you. You are crying like a child." Tiffany Preston gasped, clutching his chest. "What are you saying? We are in this together. We need to call a lawyer." "There is no we." Tiffany screamed, her voice shredding what was left of her dignity. "You are broke, Preston. You heard him. You are homeless. Do you think I signed up for this? Do you think I married you for your personality? You are a weak, spineless little man who needed his daddy to run his life, and now you do not even have his money." She turned to the guards, pointing a manicured finger at the door. "I am leaving," she announced. "I am filing for divorce in the morning, and you can tell your father that I am taking half of whatever scraps are left. I want spousal support. I want child support. I will bleed you dry for the next 18 years. She turned to storm out, her red dress swirling around her like a pool of blood. "You are not going anywhere, Tiffany." My voice stopped her dead in her tracks. I stepped into the circle of light cast by the overhead rig. The reporters raised their cameras, the shutters clicking furiously. Tiffany spun around, her eyes narrowing. "Get out of my way, old man," she hissed. "You got your company back. Congratulations. Now let me go. I have a son to raise. I reached into my inner pocket. This was the moment. The final nail in the coffin. You do not have a son with Preston, I said calmly. The silence that followed was heavy. Preston looked up, his face streaked with tears, confusion warring with panic. What Preston whispered. What did you say? I walked over to him. I did not look at him with anger anymore. I looked at him with pity. I held up a document. It was the paternity test I had commissioned using the DNA sample from the diaper I had retrieved from the trash during my first visit to the mansion. I handed the paper to Preston. Read it, I commanded. Preston took the paper. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold it steady. He squinted at the numbers, the scientific jargon, and then the final conclusion at the bottom of the page. Probability of paternity 0%. He looked up, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He looked at Tiffany. Tiffany, he choked out. What is this? Tiffany's face went white. She tried to lunge for the paper, but Sam stepped in her way. It is a lie, she shrieked, looking at the cameras. He forged it. He is trying to frame me. I pulled out the second document. The confession from Dr. Thorne. I held it up for the press to see. And this, I addressed the reporters, my voice projecting clearly for the microphones, is a sworn affidavit from Dr. Elias Thorne. It details how Ms. St. Clair paid him $50,000 to fake a miscarriage 2 years ago. There was never a baby then. And the baby she has now. I turned my gaze back to Tiffany, who was now trembling, her back pressed against the wall. I did some digging, Tiffany, I said. I checked the visitor logs at the gym you go to. I checked the credit card receipts for the hotel rooms. And then I ran a second DNA comparison. I pulled out a photo. It was a picture of the personal trainer, the man with the tattoo on his neck. Meet the real father, I said, dropping the photo at Preston's feet. Preston stared at the photo. He stared at the paternity test. And then he looked at his wife. The woman he had sent his own father to prison to protect. The woman he had stolen millions of dollars to impress. The woman who was currently looking at him, not with love, but with the terrified eyes of a con artist caught in the act. Is it true? Preston whispered. His voice was broken. It sounded like glass grinding in a machine. Tiffany did not answer. She didn't have to. Her silence was a confession. And then Preston screamed. It was not a scream of anger. It was a scream of agony. It was the sound of a man realizing that his entire reality was a hallucination. He fell to his knees on the dirty concrete floor. He grabbed his hair, pulling at it, rocking back and forth. I put him in jail, Preston wailed, slamming his fist into the ground until his knuckles bled. I put my own father in jail for you. I destroyed my life for you. And it was all a lie. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, filled with a horror that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dad, he sobbed. Dad, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. She told me you hurt her. She told me the baby was mine. I looked down at him. He was a ruin of a man. A shell. Ignorance is not a defense, Preston, I said coldly. You chose to believe a lie because it was easier than facing the truth. You chose her over your own blood. Preston crawled toward Tiffany, grabbing the hem of her red dress. You monster! He screamed, spitting the words at her. You killed us! Tiffany kicked him away. She looked at the cameras, realized her life as a socialite was over, and finally broke down. She slid down the wall, burying her face in her hands, sobbing not for what she had done, but for what she had lost. I turned to the press. You have your story, I said. The fraud, the adultery, the theft. Print it all. I looked at Sam. Call the police, I ordered. We have a confession to file, and I believe there are outstanding warrants for both of them now. I turned and walked toward the exit door. Behind me, the sound of Preston's weeping mixed with the flashing of cameras and the shouting of reporters. It was a symphony of destruction. I walked out into the cool night air. The gala was still going on inside, but the party was over. The house of cards had fallen, and I was the only one left standing. The night air outside the museum was no longer cool and quiet. It was a cacophony of sirens and shouting. The red and blue lights of the police cruisers bounced off the wet pavement, creating a strobe effect that made everything look like a fractured nightmare. I stood near the valet stand, watching the scene unfold. The guests from the gala had spilled out onto the grand staircase, their expensive gowns and tuxedos huddled together against the wind, their phones raised high to capture the fall of the House of Ford. They had come to see a coronation, but they were staying for an execution. Sam had done his job well. The police had arrived in force. They were not the local beat cops who might look the other way for a donation. These were detectives from the Financial Crimes Division and officers from the state prosecutor's office. They moved with a grim efficiency that told me they had read the files Garrett and I had sent over. They knew exactly who they were looking for. Tiffany was the first to emerge from the side exit. She was flanked by two female officers who held her by the arms. Her red dress, which had looked so regal on stage, now looked like a costume from a cheap play. Her hair was wild, her makeup smeared across her cheeks. She was not going quietly. She was screaming, kicking her heels against the concrete, trying to twist away from the grip of the law. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, her voice raw. "Do you know who I am? I am a Ford. My husband owns this city. Unhand me immediately, or I will sue you for everything you have." One of the detectives, a tall man with a weary face, stepped in front of her. He did not look impressed. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal glinted in the flashing lights. "Tiffany St. Clair," he said, his voice cutting through her hysterics. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit extortion. You have the right to remain silent." He spun her around. The sound of the cuffs ratcheting shut was sharp and final. Tiffany gasped. The reality of the cold steel against her wrists seemed to shock her into silence. She looked up and saw me standing 10 feet away. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. She opened her mouth to curse me, but the officers shoved her forward, guiding her toward the back of a waiting cruiser. She was shoved inside, her head ducking low, the heavy door slamming shut on her screams. Then came Preston. He walked out slowly. He was not fighting. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. His tuxedo jacket was gone, lost somewhere in the backstage scuffle. His white shirt was torn and stained. He blinked in the harsh glare of the police lights, disoriented and broken. When the officers approached him, he raised his hands instinctively, a gesture of surrender he should have made 2 years ago. "Preston Ford," the detective announced, reading from a warrant. "You are under arrest for corporate embezzlement, perjury, and filing a false police report." Preston did not answer. He let them pull his arms behind his back. He let them lock the cuffs. He looked numb. But then, as they began to lead him down the steps, his eyes swept the crowd. He saw the faces of his former friends, the investors, the socialites. He saw them recording his shame. And then he saw me. I was standing alone near the fountain, my hands in my pockets, my face impassive. I was not smiling. There is no joy in watching your own blood being put in chains, but there is satisfaction in justice. Preston stopped. He planted his feet, fighting against the officer's grip. "Dad," he cried out. The officers tried to push him forward, but he threw his weight back, desperate to reach me. "Dad, wait. Please." He broke free from one of the officers for just a second, stumbling toward me. He fell to his knees on the wet asphalt, sliding until he was right in front of me. He looked up, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat and the dirt. He looked like a child again, the little boy who used to scrape his knees and run to me for comfort. But that boy was dead. He had been killed by the man kneeling before me. "Dad." "Please," he sobbed, trying to reach for my hand with his bound wrists. "Stop this. Tell them it was a mistake. I am your son. You cannot let them take me to prison. I will die in there." I looked down at him. I saw the fear in his eyes. It was the same fear I had felt every night for 730 days. The fear of the cage. The fear of being forgotten. "I made a mistake," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I was stupid. I was weak. But I am family. You said family protects each other. Save me, Dad. Please save me." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the toe of my shoe, weeping uncontrollably. I looked at the crowd. They were silent, watching the final act of the tragedy. I looked at the police officers who had paused, giving us a moment. They waited for my signal. They thought perhaps the father would soften. They thought perhaps mercy would win. I leaned down. I got close enough so that only he could hear me. I smelled the fear on him. "I protected you for 40 years, Preston," I said, my voice low and hard like granite. "I gave you a home. I gave you an education. I gave you a company. I taught you right from wrong. I taught you that a man's word is his bond." Preston looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, Dad." I stood up straight, towering over him. "But you did not learn," I said. "You chose to listen to greed. You chose to listen to a liar. And when I tried to warn you, you locked me away to silence me." I pulled my foot back, breaking the contact between us. I kicked his hand away gently but firmly, a gesture of absolute rejection. "I have taught you everything I can, son," I said coldly, "and you failed every test. So now I am sending you to a new school." Preston's eyes went wide with horror. "No," he gasped. "No, Dad, please. Let prison teach you," I said. "Maybe the walls will teach you the value of freedom. Maybe the silence will teach you the value of truth, because I am done teaching you." I nodded to the officers. "Take him," I said. Preston screamed. It was a long, agonizing wail that tore through the night. The officers grabbed him by the shoulders and hauled him to his feet. He thrashed and kicked, looking back at me with eyes full of betrayal, but I did not look away. I watched him being dragged toward the second cruiser. The press surged forward, the flashbulbs exploding like lightning, illuminating his twisted face one last time before he was shoved into the back seat. The door slammed shut. The lock clicked. The sirens wailed as the cars pulled away, their red lights fading into the distance, carrying away the rot that had infected my life. I stood there in the aftermath, the rain starting to fall again, washing the pavement clean. The guests began to disperse, whispering nervously, avoiding my gaze. They knew that the man standing by the fountain was not just a survivor. He was a force of nature. I took a deep breath. The air tasted cold and sweet. My son was gone. My daughter-in-law was gone. My house was empty. But for the first time in 2 years, I was not alone. I had my dignity. I had my truth. And tomorrow, I had a company to rebuild. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite on the 42nd floor. It was a clean, sharp light, not the gray gloom that had hung over the city on the day of my release. The office had been restored. The treadmill was gone. The mirrors were gone. My mahogany desk was back in its rightful place, polished to a shine that reflected the skyline of the empire I had built. The air smelled of fresh coffee and expensive leather. It smelled of order. I sat in my high-backed chair, signing the final stack of documents. My hand was steady. The signature was bold and sweeping, just as it had been 30 years ago. Across from me sat Sarah. She was no longer the frightened waitress in a stained uniform hiding in a diner booth. She was wearing a tailored navy suit that fit her perfectly. Her hair was styled, and her eyes behind her new glasses were sharp and intelligent. She was reviewing the quarterly projections on her tablet, tapping the screen with the confidence of a seasoned executive. I had appointed her chief financial officer 2 weeks ago. Some of the board members had raised their eyebrows at her lack of corporate experience, but after she found 3 hidden accounts that Preston had used to siphon money, they went silent. She had the one qualification that mattered more than an MBA. She had integrity. I placed the pen down on the document. It was done. The Harlan Ford Legal Defense Fund is officially established, I said, sliding the paper across the desk. $5 million in initial funding. It will provide top-tier legal representation for elderly people who are being financially exploited by their families. No one should have to rot in a cell because their children want an early inheritance. Sarah took the document and smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes. "It is going to change a lot of lives, Harlan," she said. "I have already hired 3 lawyers from the district attorney's office to head the team. They start on Monday." "Good," I said, leaning back. "And how is Danny?" "He loves the new school," she said, her face lighting up. "He asked if Grandpa is coming to his soccer game on Saturday." I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with money or power. "Tell him I will be there," I said. "And tell him I am bringing the orange slices." The intercom on my desk buzzed, interrupting the moment. It was my assistant. Her voice sounded hesitant. "Mr. Ford," she said, "I have a collect call from the state correctional facility. It is Preston. Do you want me to block it?" I looked at the phone. The red light was blinking, a rhythmic, pulsing warning. Sarah looked up at me, her expression tightening. She did not say anything, but I knew what she was thinking. She was thinking about the fear, the threats, the years of manipulation. I stared at the light for a long moment. 2 years ago, I would have answered immediately. I would have rushed to fix whatever mess he had made. I would have paid the bail, hired the experts, and buried the truth. But the man who did that was gone. He had died in a prison cell, leaving behind only the nemesis. "Put him through," I said. "But keep it on speaker." There was a click, and then the automated voice announced that the call was being recorded. Then came the sound of heavy breathing and background noise. Clanging doors, shouting, the sounds of hell. Dad Preston's voice crackled through the speaker. It was thin and desperate. "Dad, are you there?" "I am here, Preston," I said, my voice flat. "Oh, thank God," he sobbed. "Dad, you have to help me. This place, it is a nightmare. The public defender you left me with is an idiot. He says I am looking at 10 to 15 years. 10 years, Dad. I will be 50 when I get out. You have to get me a real lawyer. Get Garrett, please. I know you are angry, but you cannot let me rot in here." I listened to his pleading. I waited for a sign of remorse. I waited to hear him ask about his son. I waited to hear him apologize to Sarah. But there was nothing. Only his own pain. Only his own needs. Even in chains, he was still the same selfish boy who thought the world owed him a living. "I am not angry, Preston," I said calmly. "Anger implies surprise, and I am not surprised anymore." "Dad, stop the lecture," Preston shouted, his voice rising in panic. "I need money. I need an appeal. You have millions. Just transfer some to my commissary account at least." "I am hungry, Dad. The food here is sludge." I looked at the sandwich on my desk that I hadn't touched yet. "The food is supposed to be bad." "Preston," I said, "it is prison. I ate it for 2 years. You will get used to it." "Dad, please," he wailed. "I am your son. Blood is thicker than water, remember. You always said that." I reached out and hovered my finger over the disconnect button. "I did say that," I replied. But I learned something new in the dark Preston. Blood may be thicker than water, but it can also be poisonous. And when a limb is gangrenous, you do not keep it because it is part of you. You cut it off to save the body. No, Dad, wait, do not hang up, Preston screamed. I already have, I said. I pressed the button. The line went dead. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not heavy. It was not sad. It was light. It was the feeling of a heavy pack being dropped after a long hike. I looked at Sarah. She was watching me with tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of understanding. Are you okay? She asked softly. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. The cars looked like toys. The people looked like ants. Life was going on down there, chaotic and beautiful. I am better than okay, I said. I am free. I turned back to look at her. People say that family is everything. They say you have to forgive them no matter what they do. They say that biology is destiny. But they are wrong. Family is not about whose DNA you share. It is about who stands by you in the rain. It is about who respects you when you have nothing. It is about who tells you the truth even when it hurts. I walked over and placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. I lost a son, I said. A son who saw me as nothing more than a bank account. But I gained a daughter who sees me as a man. And on Saturday, I am going to watch my grandson play soccer. That is a fair trade. I walked back to my desk and picked up my pen. Now, I said, let us get back to work. We have an empire to run. This story teaches us a harsh but necessary truth. Toxic behavior should never be tolerated simply because it comes from family. Harlan spent years enabling his son's entitlement, believing that love meant shielding him from consequences. It was only when he was stripped of his dignity that he realized true family is built on respect, integrity, and mutual care, not just shared blood. Setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of self-preservation. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from the people who hurt you to find the peace you deserve. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to stand up for your own worth against those closest to you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us share more stories of resilience and justice. And I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to save yourself? Let me know your story in the comments below. See you in the next video.